The night air outside the Crimson Theatre carried the damp chill of late autumn, yet inside, the corridors pulsed with warmth, light, and the restless energy of opening night. The audience had arrived in glittering waves, filling the velvet seats and balconies, their voices rising like a low tide of anticipation. Backstage, however, the atmosphere was tighter, sharper. Every footstep echoed with urgency. Every whisper seemed edged with nerves. For this evening was not merely a performance, it was a return. After years of scandal and financial ruin, the Crimson Theatre had reopened under new management, and the success of tonight's premiere would decide its fate. At precisely 8 minutes before the curtain, a scream tore through the building. It began as a single startled cry, then broke into frantic shouting. Stagehands rushed toward the source, actors froze in half-applied makeup, and the orchestra faltered into silence. The scream had come from the private dressing suite at the end of the upper corridor, a room reserved only for the theatre's new owner, Victor Langley, who had insisted on overseeing every detail of the production. The door was locked from the inside. By the time the manager, pale and shaking, forced it open with a heavy brass fire hook, a small crowd had gathered. They stopped as one upon seeing the body. Victor Langley lay sprawled across the polished wooden floor, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, eyes wide in a final expression of disbelief. There was no sign of struggle. His jacket remained perfectly buttoned, his cufflinks aligned, his hair immaculate. Only a thin, dark line at the side of his throat revealed the cause of death, a precise, fatal incision. The room itself seemed untouched. A single chair stood near the vanity. The tall mirror reflected the open doorway and the horrified faces beyond. The windows were closed and latched. No weapon was visible. The police arrived swiftly, sealing the theatre and questioning every member of staff and cast. No one had entered or left the corridor. The suite had only one door. The windows overlooked a sheer stone drop into the alley below. It was, beyond doubt, an impossible crime. Yet the strangest detail was not the locked room. It was the object resting in the victim's hand. Langley's fingers clutched a small Crimson Theatre ticket identical to those issued for the premiere. On the back, written in black ink, was a single word: encore. No one admitted to writing it. No one could explain it. The ticket itself had not been sold. Its serial number matched a batch that had been destroyed weeks earlier after a printing error. The police dismissed it at first as theatrical nonsense, but the unease it created spread quickly through the building. For there had been rumors. Langley had many enemies. He had purchased the theatre from a bankrupt family who claimed he had ruined them. He had dismissed veteran actors without explanation. He had cancelled long-standing contracts, angering powerful investors. Some whispered he had even forced the previous owner's daughter into exile. But none of that explained the locked room, nor the ticket. As the night deepened, the audience was quietly dismissed, their excitement turning to speculation. Outside, crowds gathered, hungry for scandal. Inside, the cast and crew remained confined, their alibis tightening like knots. Near midnight, a small, precise man arrived at the theatre, stepping from a hired cab with the calm assurance of someone entering a drawing room rather than a crime scene. His moustache was immaculate despite the damp air, his eyes bright with curiosity. He introduced himself with gentle politeness. He had been invited, he explained, by an anonymous note delivered that very evening to his hotel, urging him to attend the premiere and observe the final act. Now, standing over the body, he studied the ticket in silence. At last he smiled faintly. "This," he said, "is not merely a murder, it is a performance. And the killer wishes an audience." He glanced around the silent dressing room, as though expecting applause. "And I fear," he added softly, "that the encore has only just begun." The inspector in charge, a tall, methodical man with tired eyes and an expression of quiet irritation, cleared his throat. He had already introduced himself, and though he had listened politely, it was clear he did not welcome interference. Still, the reputation of the small Belgian gentleman standing before him was not something he could easily dismiss. "You understand, sir," he said, "this is a straightforward matter. Locked room, limited suspects. We shall proceed in the usual way." "Mais oui," the little detective replied pleasantly, "and I shall proceed in mine." Without waiting for permission, he began to move about the dressing suite with light, careful steps, as though he feared disturbing invisible threads. His gaze passed over the body, the vanity, the chair, the carpet, the mirror. He did not touch anything at first. Instead, he simply looked. The inspector watched with growing impatience. You see, there is nothing, no weapon, no disturbance. The man was alone.
Was he?
The detective murmured. He bent slightly, studying the floor near the victim's hand. There was no blood beyond the thin line at the throat, which suggested a swift and professional act. He nodded faintly, as though confirming a private thought. Then his eyes moved to the ticket. Encore, he read softly again. Some theatrical nonsense, the inspector said. We have questioned everyone. No one knows anything. Yes, that is always what they say. He turned toward the vanity. At first glance, it appeared ordinary brushes, cologne, a silver cigarette case. Yet he leaned closer. One item, small and almost invisible, caught his attention, a speck of pale powder. He touched it gently with the tip of his glove and brought it to his nose. His eyes sharpened. Interesting. What is it? The inspector asked. Not face powder. Too fine. And here, only here. He glanced at Langley's immaculate appearance. The victim wore none, and yet it is present upon the table. The inspector frowned. Perhaps from an actress. Perhaps. But then, why only this little trace? Why not more? He moved away, scanning the room again. His gaze settled on the chair. It stood angled slightly toward the door, as though someone had been sitting there, waiting. Yet Langley had been found near the center of the room. You say he was alone? Yes, and he locked the door. So it appears. The detective nodded. Then, unexpectedly, he walked to the mirror and stood where the chair faced. He sat down, folding his hands, looking at the reflection. For several moments, he said nothing. Then he smiled. The arrangement is wrong. Wrong? Yes. If a man sits here, he watches the door. He expects someone. He prepares. Yet when he died, he stood there. He pointed to the body's position. Why does he rise? Why does he turn his back to the mirror? The inspector hesitated. To greet the visitor. Exactly. So he knew the visitor. He was not afraid. The inspector's irritation deepened. We have already established that the killer must be someone he trusted. Ah, but there is more. At that moment, the door opened, and a young actress was brought in for further questioning. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying. She froze when she saw the body and pressed a hand to her mouth. The detective watched her closely. You knew Monsieur Langley well?
Yes.
He gave me this role, she said shakily. You spoke with him this evening? Only briefly. Did you come to this room? No. The answer came too quickly, too sharp. The inspector noticed it as well. You are certain? Yes. The detective's gaze dropped to her hands. There, on the delicate skin near her thumb, was the faintest trace of pale powder. He smiled gently, almost kindly. Mademoiselle, he said, it is curious. You did not come here, and yet the room has come to you. She stared at him, frozen. The inspector stepped forward. What do you mean? The detective's voice remained soft, but the tension in the room tightened like a drawn wire. I mean, my friend, that already we see the first illusion. The theater is full of them tonight. Someone performs a role, someone lies, but not yet do we know the truth. He turned once more to the mirror, and the audience, he said quietly, is only beginning to understand the play. The young actress remained rigid, her eyes fixed on the detective, as though he had spoken some private thought aloud. The inspector, however, wasted no time. He ordered that all principal members of the cast and staff be assembled in the rehearsal hall. No one was permitted to leave. The theater, once filled with excitement, had now become a cage. They gathered beneath the dim ghost lights, their shadows stretching across the empty stage. Costumes glittered strangely in the half-dark, and the smell of grease paint and dust hung in the air. The detective stood slightly apart, observing them as though he were indeed watching a performance. The actress was questioned first. Her name was Clara Delmont. She admitted, after some hesitation, that she had visited the dressing suite earlier in the evening. He wished to discuss changes to the final scene, she said, her voice trembling. He was very particular, you see, the inspector said. Nothing unusual. But the detective tilted his head. And this powder, mademoiselle? She swallowed. Stage powder. I had just come from makeup. And you touched the table? Yes. Yet you told us you did not enter the room.
I was frightened.
She said quickly. I thought it would make me look suspicious. The inspector frowned. What happened during this meeting? He seemed nervous. He kept looking at the door. He asked whether anyone had spoken to me, whether anyone had tried to influence me. Influence you? How? She hesitated. To leave the production. A murmur spread through the group. The detective's eyes brightened. And had anyone? She glanced toward a tall, dark-haired man standing near the wings. Mr. Adrian Voss. He said the theatre was dangerous, that I should resign. Voss stepped forward at once, calm and composed. I was concerned for her. Langley had enemies. Did you visit him tonight? The inspector asked. Yes, about an hour before the murder. And we argued. I wanted him to reconsider dismissing several of the older actors. He refused. Did you threaten him? Of course not. The detective studied him. You left him alive? Yes. Was he alone? Yes. Locked door. I did not notice. The detective nodded slowly, then turned to another figureer, middle-aged stage manager with nervous hands.
You also saw Monsieur Langley?
Yes, the man said, shortly after Mr. Voss. He told me to ensure no one disturbed him. Did he seem afraid? Yes, but also relieved, as though he expected someone. Did you see that person? No. The contradictions began to form like cracks in glass. The detective moved among them, asking small, precise questions. Each answer seemed reasonable on its own, yet together they formed a strange pattern. Times overlapped. Movements conflicted. Several people claimed to have been in places where others insisted they had not been. One elderly actress declared she had been rehearsing alone in the lower hall, yet a stagehand swore the room had been empty. A lighting technician insisted the upper corridor had been deserted, but another remembered hearing voices there. Most curious of all was the theatre's accountant, a thin man with darting eyes. He spoke eagerly, almost too eagerly. I was in the office the entire time, he said. You may check. I heard nothing, saw nothing. Yet you knew of the murder before the scream, the detective said quietly. The man froze. What? You arrived at the corridor before the others.
How did you know where to go?
The accountant's mouth opened and closed. I heard running. But the screen had not yet reached that part of the building, the detective said gently. Silence fell. The inspector leaned forward. Explain yourself. The man stammered something about confusion, nerves, coincidence. But the calm confidence had vanished. The detective smiled faintly. So many voices, he said softly. Each tells the true at hand yet, not the whole truth. Every one of you hides something. Fear, ambition, resentment, motives everywhere. He looked up at the stage, where the heavy crimson curtain hung motionless. And still, we do not see the killer. But we begin to hear the music behind the performance. He turned back to them, his gaze sharp now. And soon, he said, the false notes will betray the composer. The silence after his words lingered like a held breath. No one moved. The stage lights hummed faintly, and somewhere in the depths of the theatre, a door creaked, as though the building itself were listening. The inspector cleared his throat. We shall verify every statement. Until then, no one leaves. But the detective seemed already far ahead. He walked slowly along the edge of the stage, hands clasped behind his back, his eyes moving from face to face. You see, he said quietly, a murder such as this is never born from one emotion alone. It is a chorus, many voices, many motives. Let us listen carefully. He stopped before Adrian Voss. You argued with the victim. You feared for the future of the company. Why? Voss met his gaze steadily. Because Langley intended to replace us all. He planned to bring in new performers, cheaper and obedient. Those of us who built this theatre would be discarded. So your career, your reputation, everything was threatened. Yes. And perhaps, the detective added gently, your control. You were once the star here. Voss' jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The detective moved on. Mademoiselle Delmont, you were the new favorite. Yet someone urged you to resign. Why? She hesitated. I do not know. But you benefited from Langley's protection. Without him, your position becomes uncertain. Her eyes filled with tears. I would never none, I do not accuse. I observe. He turned toward the elderly actress. Madame Renaud, you lost your leading roles when the management changed. She lifted her chin. I have given my life to this theatre. Langley treated us like expendable props, yet you remained. Because this place is my home, or because you hoped he would fail. She said nothing. The detective's attention shifted to the accountant, who now looked as though he wished to vanish into the floor. Monsieur Hale, the finances of the theatre were...
Complicated, yes?
The man nodded weakly, and Langley discovered certain irregularities. Hale's lips trembled. I intended to correct them, but he intended to dismiss you. Yes, perhaps even prosecute you. The man lowered his head. The inspector's eyes sharpened. You did not mention this. I was afraid, Hale whispered. The detective nodded. Fear is a powerful motive. He began to pace again, his voice thoughtful. We have ambition, resentment, jealousy, and terror, but still the crime remains impossible. Each motive alone explains only part. The locked room refuses them all. He stopped suddenly and looked toward the stage manager. You said Langley seemed relieved. Yes, as though he expected someone. Yes, and he ordered that he not be disturbed. Yes, then he trusted this person. The detective's gaze grew distant, as though he were seeing something none of the others could. Trust, he murmured, and yet he prepared. He sat watching the door. He rose when the visitor entered. No struggle, a swift death. The inspector folded his arms. So the killer was known to him. That is obvious, yes, but incomplete. The detective turned back to the group. Consider the ticket. Encore, a message, a promise of continuation. This was not only revenge, it was theatre. Clara spoke in a small voice. What do you mean? I mean, he said, that the murder was designed to be discovered. The locked room, the clue, the audience of suspects. Someone wished to create confusion, to direct suspicion everywhere. He looked again at the crimson curtain, his eyes narrowing. And therefore, we must ask not only who wished Langley dead, but who wished the investigation to fail. The words struck the group with fresh unease. The inspector frowned. You believe there is more than one crime? The detective smiled faintly. I believe there is more than one purpose. He clasped his hands. Some seek money, some seek power, some seek escape. But one among you seeks something far more dangerous. And that, he said softly, is freedom. The inspector's voice echoed through the rehearsal hall like a triumphant drumbeat. We have it, he declared, slapping a folder onto the edge of the stage. A confession has been secured. The murderer is identified. He gestured to the accountant, Hale, whose shoulders sagged under the weight of sudden accusation. The room seemed to inhale collectively, relief mingling with unease. Some of the cast whispered, others nodded, and a few let out shaky laughter, convinced the nightmare was over. Hale's voice was barely audible. I did speak to him tonight. I warned Himtrid to prevent disaster, but I swear I did not harm him. Nonsense, the inspector barked. You had motive, opportunity, knowledge. Everything points to you. He looked around proudly. Case closed. The detective, however, remained silent, his small frame resting against the wings of the stage. His eyes traced the shadows along the walls, the corners where light fell unevenly, the monotonous details the others overlooked. He tilted his head and let his gaze linger on the crimson ticket clasped in Langley's hand, the word Encore stark against its background. May I? He asked softly, and without waiting for permission, he stepped forward and picked up the folder. Flipping through the statements, he examined Hale's handwriting, the carefully constructed alibi, the timing of the accountant's movements. He nodded faintly, murmuring, Everything fits too neatly. The inspector frowned. What do you mean? Consider this, the detective said, pacing slowly in front of the gathered company. Hale is nervous, yes. He has reasons to lie. Yet a murderer rarely leaves behind a confession so willingly. And if you notice, he held up the folder. Every other statement is arranged to corroborate his guilt. Convenient, yes? The cast exchanged glances. Anxiety fluttered like moths against a dim light. He crouched briefly, inspecting the polished floor near Langley's body. A faint scuff mark, almost invisible, ran diagonally across the room, as though a shoe had scraped against the edge of the rug. He touched it lightly, his fingers grazing another detail, a minuscule smear of stage powder not accounted for in any statement. His eyes flicked up toward the mirror, then to the chair. "Too orderly," he murmured. "The room, the evidence, the confessionate is all staged. A perfect performance to satisfy expectation. The real killer has done exactly what they intended: mislead us." The inspector's jaw tightened. "So what you're saying is, he's innocent?" The detective's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. "I am saying, mon ami, that nothing is as it appears. The case may seem solved to those who wish it closed, but the truth is more subtle." He straightened, his gaze sweeping over the room, settling on the smallest details of posture, the faintest tremors in hands, the calculated avoidance of eye contact. "Observe those who sigh with relief too quickly. Notice those whose eyes dart when attention is elsewhere. The culprit is here still, hidden in plain sight, watching us, waiting." Clara shivered, pressing her hands together. But if Hale didn't do it, then who? The detective held up a hand, calm and commanding. "Patience. A clever performer reveals their role only at the precise moment. The audience believes in the story, unaware of the strings that move the actors. And in this theater, some strings are invisible." Outside, the wind rattled the theater's doors, a low whisper that seemed almost like a warning. The inspector shifted uneasily. "Then we continue the investigation." "Of course," the detective said softly, his eyes glinting with sharp calculation. "But we proceed knowing this. A false victory has been celebrated, a conclusion hailed before its time. The stage is set, the actors believe their parts concluded. Yet the real dramath, true revelation has not yet arrived." The room fell silent once more, each person feeling the weight of uncertainty settle upon them. Somewhere in the shadows of the theater, the true murderer waited, patient, deliberate, and confident that the detective had yet to see the final act. The theater had grown quieter now, the tension settling over the group like a thick velvet drape. The inspector leaned against the wall, arms crossed, clearly weary from the night's emotional turbulence. Yet the detective's eyes roamed with restless energy, catching details no one else seemed to notice. The way a seam of the curtain had frayed, the faint discoloration of the stage floor near the wings, the slight tremor of a hand that had claimed innocence only moments before. He crouched to inspect the corner of the dressing suite once more, where the faint smear of stage powder lingered. His eyes narrowed, and he murmured, almost to himself, so subtle, yet so deliberate. Then he straightened abruptly, his expression sharpening. "Tell me, Monsieur Inspector," he said, "has anyone here heard of the Renaud scandal?" The inspector blinked. "Scandal? Yes. From many years ago. At the previous theatre management, long before Langley's tenure. Madame Renaud, did you not have a disagreement with the former owner's family?" The elderly actress stiffened. I prefer not to speak of it." The detective's gaze was gentle but insistent. "I do not wish to judge. But events of the past often echo into the present. The theatre keeps its secrets well, yet some refuse to remain buried." Clara Delmont shifted uneasily. "What does this have to do with tonight?" "Everything," he replied. "Consider this. Langley acquired the theatre from a family who suffered ruin, a collapse mired in betrayal and loss. Some among you were there then, witnessing injustice firsthand. Resentment lingers. Some ambitions are shaped in shadows decades old, and a theatre, mon ami, preserves memory more sharply than one might expect." He turned to the group, his gaze sweeping over them. "Madame Renaud, you lost your leading roles under Langley's predecessor, did you not?" "Yes," she admitted reluctantly. "And you bear a connection to the family that once owned this theatre?" A tremor passed through her hands. I was a friend. A confidant. I swore to protect them when the world turned its back."
"Ah!"
he said softly. "And when Langley arrived, did he treat Yower, your friends, with disregard?" "Yes," she whispered. "He dismissed some, forced others away. He had no respect for loyalty." The detective nodded slowly. "And here we see the first hidden thread, a past grievance that may have persisted into the present, simmering quietly until opportunity arose." He moved toward Voss, his eyes sharp. "You, monsieur, were close to the management in years past. You observed the collapse, the bitter consequences of misjudged trust. You watched ambition and loyalty collide." Voss' jaw tightened. "Yes, I watched. But I did not participate in vengeance. Yet you know the players, the weaknesses, the fractures that linger, the detective said. And someone among you has chosen to act tonight, exploiting both old grudges and the present chaos. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Observe the ticket, encore. It is not merely a message for us. It is a reminder to those who remember, a symbol that the theatre's past is not gone, that debts and betrayals can resurface. The inspector frowned. So you believe the murder is rooted in history? Precisely. This crime is not born of immediate anger, greed, or fear alone, the detective said, his gaze softening as he returned to the dressing suite. It is born of accumulated grievance nurtured over years. The past has shaped tonight's events as surely as the present. He crouched once more, studying the subtle scuff marks on the floor, the misplaced powder, the angles of furniture. And notice how the threads of history link you all, he murmured. Friendships, rivalries, promises made and broken. Each of you shares connections others are unaware of. Some connections deliberate, others coincidental, but together they form a web, and someone has learned to navigate it with precision. He straightened and surveyed the group again. The shadows of the past do not rest easily. And in this theatre, they have risen to play their part, quietly guiding the hand that drew the knife. We are not merely solving a crime, we are uncovering a story written long before tonight, one that some would have preferred remain hidden. A chill swept through the room as his words sank in. Each person felt the weight of history pressing upon them, and a subtle, unspoken recognition passed through the group. The crime was larger than any single motive, and its architect was watching, confident that even the most astute eyes could not yet see the full picture. The detective moved away from the group, his hands clasped behind his back as he paced slowly along the empty stage. The inspector watched with growing impatience, but the little man's eyes were fixed on the subtle details, the small inconsistencies that had already hinted at deception. He paused mid-step and turned toward the gathered suspects. "Mon ami," he said, "I have a simple test, nothing more than observation, yet it will tell us much." The inspector frowned. "Observation?" "Yes. I wish to examine the way each of you reacts to a question, not the question itself." He looked at Clara Delmont first, his gaze sharp but gentle. "Mademoiselle, if you please." She stepped forward hesitantly. "Do you regret your presence in this theatre tonight?" Clara blinked, uncertain. "Regret? Yes. Not because of the murder, but because of choices made long ago. Think carefully." She hesitated, then lowered her eyes. "No, I do not regret. I merely wish the truth were known." The detective nodded and moved on to the others, asking similarly abstract, almost philosophical questions, whether they believed loyalty more binding than ambition, whether fear could compel one to betray a friend, whether a theatre could forgive a sin committed on its stage. Most answered with caution, some with nervous laughter, and a few, like Madame Renaud, spoke with measured, almost rehearsed precision. But then he turned to Adrian Voss. "Do you believe a theatre remembers all wrongs committed within its walls?" he asked. Voss stiffened. His eyes flickered briefly toward the wings, then to the dressing suite. A theatre is a building. It cannot remember, it only witnesses." The detective's eyes twinkled. But does the witness influence the witnesser? Does the stage impose itself upon those who walk upon it? Voss' face tightened. He paused, then forced a smile. "I do not understand." "Yet you do," the detective said softly. "You understand more than you admit. And the question is not for you, Monsieur, is for me to observe your answer." He stepped closer, tilting his head in the manner of a man listening to invisible chords. "A subtle tremor, a slight hesitation, the direction of your gazethes betray more than words ever could." The inspector watched, puzzled. "I fail to see, you will see if you observe closely," the detective replied, brushing a finger lightly along the edge of the stage, as though tracing a secret pattern. "Some secrets are revealed only when one believes themselves safe." He then performed a small, unconventional experiment. He requested that each suspect pick up a prop from the stage, a simple object. A feathered mask, a silver candlestick, a velvet glaive, hold it in their hands while answering a neutral question about the evening's rehearsal. Most complied obediently, their movements careful, their expressions controlled. But when Voss took the candlestick, his fingers tightened around it in a subtle yet unmistakable grip. His eyes flicked toward the dressing suite. and for an instant the faintest flush of color passed over his cheeks. The detective noted it instantly. "Ah," he murmured almost to himself, "so the hand betrays the mind before the mind betrays the tongue." He straightened, addressing the room. "Observe carefully. A simple test, a meaningless object, yet the way one interacts with it tells the story the words do not. Fear, anticipation, guilt all leave traces, and one trace, no matter how small, can unravel a carefully constructed lie." Voss, realizing perhaps that he had been caught in this quiet scrutiny, shifted uneasily. He began, but the detective raised a hand. "No words yet. Let your actions speak, monsieur. For tonight, the stage has more witnesses than your eyes imagine, and they whisper truths that none can disguise." A palpable tension filled the theater. Every suspect felt it, the invisible net tightening, catching the smallest tremor, the slightest misstep. Somewhere, the true criminal remained poised in the shadows, but the detective's unconventional method had forced a crack in the mask, and through that crack, the faintest light of truth began to shine. The detective had been quiet for several minutes, letting the tension settle, observing the subtle movements of each suspect as they fidgeted with props or shifted their weight uneasily. The inspector, growing restless, muttered about finalizing statements and locking down evidence. Yet the little Belgian's eyes were fixed on the crimson ticket, still lying on the floor near where Langley had fallen. He crouched to examine it again, noting the faint indentation of handwriting and the slightly irregular fold that hinted it had been handled deliberately. "Inspector," he said softly, "please place this in secure custody. It is most important." The inspector nodded and picked up the ticket, placing it in an evidence envelope, sealing it carefully with a flourish. "Nothing leaves this room now," he said, trying to sound authoritative. "We are done with theatrics." The detective, however, continued to pace. His attention had shifted to a small dressing table against the far wall. Among brushes, powders, and personal effects lay the velvet glove Clara had held during his unconventional test. He bent to inspect it, noting a faint smear of residue on the silk lining, a trace too precise to be accidental. He looked up, ready to speak, when a loud crash echoed from the corridor outside. A stagehand burst into the room, panting. "The evidence, Langley's personal journal, it's gone." The inspector's face drained of color. "Gone? How? I don't know," the stagehand stammered. "I left it on the counter to secure it, and when I returned nothing." The detective's eyes narrowed. He stepped to the door, peering into the dimly lit corridor. No one lingered. The only sound was the faint hum of the theater's ventilation. "Interesting," he murmured. "Someone among us is not content merely to mislead thee, wish to erase the truth entirely." The inspector slammed his fist against the stage. "This is sabotage. The case is compromised." The detective shook his head slightly, calm as ever. "Not compromised, monsieur. Delayed. But notice the boldness. Whoever took the journal knows its significance and intends to manipulate perception. They hope to close the investigation before the story is fully understood." He turned slowly back toward the suspects, his gaze sweeping the room. "Observe their reactions. Fear, surprise, indifferential tell a story. The guilty do not always confess in words. Sometimes it is the pause, the flinch, the tightening of a fist." Clara's hand went to her mouth, eyes wide. Madame Renaud's lips pressed into a thin line. Voss shifted his weight, glancing toward the wings as though planning an exit. Even Hale, the accountant, looked away sharply, though his demeanor remained nervous, constrained. The detective crouched again, inspecting the area where the journal had rested. He noted the faint indentation on the counter, the small smear of dust on the polished wood that suggested something had been lifted swiftly. He traced the angle of removal, noting the faint footprints in the powder from the dressing table, and realized that the thief had left a single, telling signature. Too much haste, yet precise enough to avoid suspicion. "See," he murmured to the inspector, "this is the work of someone confident in their knowledge of the theater, of its routines, its shadows. They do not merely anticipate every response, every scrutiny. They are clever, patient, and observant." The inspector ran a hand through his hair. "So what now? How can we proceed without the journal?" The detective straightened, his small frame radiating authority. "We proceed by what remains. The powder, the smudges, the subtle inconsistencies in timing and alibithy are as telling as any written page. And remember this, the thief has revealed themselves by their own audacity. Whoever took the journal believes they are in control, yet in truth, they have only illuminated the path to discovery. A hush fell over the room. Each suspect felt the invisible gaze of the detective, noting how little could be hidden when even the shadows spoke. The stolen evidence had raised the stakes, but it had also exposed the cunning of the criminal. And somewhere, in the quiet, dim corners of the theater, the true culprit must have recognized the danger that now closed in, realizing, perhaps, that no trick, no matter how meticulous, could escape the observation of a mind attuned to every whisper, every tremor, every hidden sign. The theater was silent now, the heavy velvet curtains swaying slightly from a draught that whispered through the upper corridors. A detective stood in the center of the stage, scanning each suspect with those piercing, calculating eyes, aware that someone among them had already proven bold enough to steal Langley's journal. The inspector hovered uneasily at his side, fidgeting with his notes, every shadow in the hall setting his nerves on edge. Then came the sound of faint scraping, almost imperceptible at first, followed by the unmistakable click of a latch. The detective's gaze snapped toward the wings just in time to catch a shadow slipping across the floor, disappearing into the maze of corridors behind the stage. "Someone is moving," he said quietly, raising a hand to still the murmuring suspects. "And I suspect they are heading towards something vital." The inspector cursed under his breath. "Should we pursue?" "No," the detective said softly, a gleam in his eye. "We observe. They wish to reveal themselves. We shall wait until the act is completia interrupted." Moments later, a scream shattered the tense quiet. It came from the upper balcony, followed by a second, sharper, more desperate cry. The detective bolted up the staircase with astonishing agility, the inspector and a few stagehands in tow. At the balcony, the scene was chaos. A second victim had fallen this time. The theater's lighting designer, a wiry man named Moreau, lay sprawled across the floor. His lamp had been knocked over, its wires tangled, the bulb shattered. Yet it was not the injury that struck most, it was the way he clutched his own hand, trembling, pointing toward the darkened corner near the control room. The detective stepped forward, crouching beside the fallen man. Moreau gasped, his eyes wide. The journal," he whispered. "I saw someone taking it in the wings. He knows we're close." His voice trailed off into unconsciousness. The inspector knelt beside him. "Call a doctor!" The detective did not move from the spot where Moreau had fallen. His sharp eyes swept the room, catching the faintest scuff on the balcony railing, a slight smear of dust on the floor that had not been there before, the angle of a missing chair. Every detail told him that the perpetrator had been methodical, precise, and deliberately theatrical, an artist of crime. He rose slowly, addressing the room, voice calm but commanding. "Notice this is no random act of panic. The culprit is aware of our progress. Each step we take is anticipated. Each conclusion we draw has already been considered by them. They are several moves ahead." Clara Delmont trembled at his words. "But why target him? To send a message," the detective said, his eyes scanning the dark corners of the balcony and the shadowed corridors beyond. Langley was the first warning, Hale's accusation the second, now Morawi, because the observer must be silenced before they see too clearly. A sudden movement caught his eye. A figure darted from the shadows along the upper corridor, a hand clutching something metallic that glinted faintly in the dim light. Without hesitation, the detective lunged forward, but the figure vanished behind a stage door, leaving only the echo of hurried footsteps. The inspector muttered, "Thea slipping through our fingers." "Indeed," the detective replied, eyes narrowing. "And note this every disappearance, every theft, every tremor of fear is deliberate. The villain is orchestrating events like a conductor. But even a maestro can be anticipated if one understands the rhythm." He turned to the assembled suspects, voice soft, but carrying authority. "Understand this. We are no longer merely solving a past murder. The perpetrator intends another act, and we must anticipate it. They are testing our resolve, probing our weaknesses, and we are learning from each misstep. The stage is set, and they believe the finale is theirs to write. Yet I assure you, the final act is far from concluded. A chill passed through the theatre as his words settled. The players realized that the danger was immediate, that the criminal's shadow lingered over them, and that the detective, though calm and composed, now faced not just a mystery to solve, but a catastrophe to prevent, an unseen enemy several steps ahead, orchestrating a deadly performance in which every wrong move could be fatal. The theatre was cloaked in a tense stillness after Moreau's collapse, the echoes of his last words lingering like smoke through the corridors. The inspector paced restlessly, muttering about missed opportunities, but the detective remained calm, methodically examining every detail, every trace left by the unseen perpetrator. He crouched by the edge of the balcony where Moreau had fallen, noting the slight displacement of the floorboards and the faint powdery residue that clung to the railing. A small dettelbutt, it whispered a story. He straightened and moved to the center of the stage, letting his gaze sweep across the assembled suspects. Each of them appeared exhausted, fearful, yet all tried to maintain a composure that the detective found predictable. And yet, amidst the fear, he noticed patterns that the others ignored. The repeated glances toward the dressing suite, the nervous twitch of a hand brushing against a prop, the slight hesitation when one was asked a question. Then it struck him something so ordinary it might have been dismissed. The placement of the theatre tickets, not the one in Langley's hand, but the extra copies lying in the wings, backstage drawers, even tucked beneath chairs. They were not scattered randomly. Their positions corresponded to the moments when the victims had been isolated. Langley in his dressing suite, Moreau at the balcony control, Hale at the office counter. Each ticket had been placed deliberately, a breadcrumb marking the theatre's hidden pathways, a signature of the criminal's meticulous planning. The detective bent closer to examine one lying near the orchestra pit, its corner bent slightly at an angle, the ink smudged in a precise pattern. He smiled faintly. "Ah, so simple and yet elegant," he murmured. "The message has been here all along, hiding in plain sight. Every move, every act, every seemingly inconsequential object has served a purpose." He paced slowly, reconstructing the events in his mind. Langley's death, the missing journal, the terror inflicted upon Moreau, all deliberate diversions to mislead, to create chaos. Yet the true path is revealed by the minutest detailest ticket, the powder, the angle of a chair. The perpetrator underestimated how keen observation can turn apparent disorder into clarity. The inspector frowned. "But what does it mean? Who is behind all this?" The detective shook his head slightly, eyes gleaming. "It is not yet a question of identity, mon ami. It is the method, the pattern that matters. Once the sequence is understood, the criminal's movements become predictable, and a predictable hand can be trapped." He moved toward Voss, carefully noting the man's posture, the restless shifting of his feet, the nervous flicker in his eyes. "Notice the repetitions," the detective said softly. "Every suspect, every object, every whispered excuse is part of a rhythm. Some break the pattern, some reinforce it, and in this theatre, the pattern belongs to the orchestrator." Clara, still pale from fright, whispered, "So you mean the person who stole the journal and caused Moreau's accident, they've been leaving clues all along?" "Yes," the detective replied, "but not as a mistake. A conductor leaves signals for those who can read the music. The perpetrator assumes we are blind to the subtleties. Yet the tickets, the powder, the smallest gesture speak to those who pay attention." He bent to pick up a single scrap of folded paper beneath the orchestra rail, a corner inscribed with a barely visible mark, a tiny flourish that matched the indentation on Langley's ticket. Holding it carefully, he looked up at the suspects. And now the pattern emerges in full. The theatre is a stage, yes, but it is also a map, a puzzle, and the criminal has drawn their path in plain sight, believing no one would notice. Yet I have noticed. The room seemed to shrink around him, the walls pressing closer as the tension heightened. Every suspect's breath, every tremor, every small movement now carried meaning. For the first time since the murders began, the detective felt certain. The solution had always been here, woven into the theatre itself, and the moment to act to expose the unseen hand was rapidly approaching. The detective stood in the center of the stage, holding the scrap of paper and the folded tickets in his hands, letting the significance of their positions sink into the minds of the suspects. He did not need to raise his voice. The theatre itself seemed to hold its breath, listening to the cadence of his reasoning. "Now," he said softly, "we understand the pattern. Every act, every misdirection, every small clue deliberate. But we have yet to understand why. The motive is not greed. It is not simple vengeance. It is far subtler, far darker." The inspector frowned, glancing nervously at the group. "I thought you said Hale had reasons, and Voss, ambition. What else could there be?" The detective's eyes swept over them all, lingering on Madame Renaud, then on Clara, then on Voss. "Ah! You see, the motive lies not in what is immediately apparent. It lies in obsession, and obsession with control, with the theatre itself, with shaping events as if one were a playwright controlling characters upon a stage." Voss shifted under the detective's gaze, a faint tremor betraying his composure. "Langley," the detective continued, "was not merely a manager. He represented order, oversight, the threat of exposure. He saw the weaknesses, the grievances, the hidden resentments. To the criminal, Langley was an obstacle not for money, not for fame, but for influence over the theatre itself." Madame Renaud's eyes widened.
You mean...
"It's about the theatre?" "Precisely," the detective said, nodding. "The theatre is sacred to the perpetrator. It is both obsession and altar. Every act of destruction, every theft, every diversion was designed not only to eliminate Langley, but to assert dominance over the very space in which art is created, to demonstrate that the stage aimed its players under their absolute control." He stepped closer to Voss, whose face had grown pale. "Monsieur Voss, your jealousy was not of a colleague, nor of wealth. It was of authoritative ability to dictate every nuance of the theatre, to orchestrate events, to make the stage itself an instrument of your will." Voss opened his mouth, then closed it, a sharp exhale betraying his inner struggle. I did not mean you acted, yes," the detective said gently, almost kindly. "But consider how the pattern reveals your obsession. The tickets placed carefully, the powder left as a signature, the theft of the journal, the manipulation of Firol are hallmarks of a mind seeking not only to punish, but to choreograph, to conduct reality as one would a performance." The room fell silent. The other suspects watched with a mixture of horror and disbelief. Even Hale seemed to relax, recognizing that he had been falsely accused, while the true depth of the villain's mind became clear. "The motive," the detective said, holding up the tickets, "is the need to assert absolute control, not for profit, not for vengeance, but for the intoxicating certainty that every move, every reaction, every emotion can be manipulated. This is why the crime was so meticulous, so theatrical. Each death, each disappearance, each stolen object was a carefully arranged scene." He paused, letting his words sink in. "And the most dangerous part. The perpetrator believes themselves clever enough to escape detection, to maintain dominance over the theatre and over those who would observe. That is why we have been misled at every turn. The evidence seemed contradictory, the confessions false, the chaos deliberate. This is the mind of a person who lives to control, to manipulate, to dominate the stage entirely." Voss' hands trembled. You understand. You see through it all." "Exactly," the detective said, his voice calm but absolute. "And now we know why Langley, Hale, Mora each played a role in a performance not of their choosing. The true villain did not simply kill. They orchestrated. And they expected the investigation to become part of their design." The room was silent, the weight of revelation pressing down on every person present. The motive, far beyond what anyone had imagined, was clear. Not money, not revenge, but obsession, the absolute desire to control, to dictate, to dominate not just the theatre, but the lives and actions of all within it. And the detective, having understood the mind behind the crimes, knew that the final act, when the villain revealed themselves, would be both inevitable and devastating. The theatre seemed to hold its breath as the detective moved with quiet purpose toward the wings, where shadows pooled thickly in the dim light. The suspects had been gathered again, ostensibly for further questioning, but he had a plan that required patience, timing, and careful orchestration. The stolen journal, the meticulously placed tickets, the powder traces, the subtle tremors of guilt, all of these elements had converged in his mind into a single, undeniable pattern. Tonight, the stage would reveal the truth. "Mon ami," he said softly to the inspector, "we must proceed with precision. The culprit believes they have been clever, that the chaos they created has shielded them, but every misstep, every signature act, has led us here." He signaled for Clara to accompany him, and together they moved to the center of the stage. There, the detective arranged the props, the tickets, a stray feathered mask, a velvet gloveel deliberately placed to catch the eye, yet to suggest something ordinary. The suspects watched with growing unease. Even Hale, previously accused, shifted nervously, sensing that a decisive moment had arrived. "Observe," the detective said, voice calm and deliberate, "how the theatre can guide even the cleverest mind. Notice the patterns, the placement, the subtle cues. And now," he added, raising his hand, "let us see who responds when the stage itself confronts them." He called Voss forward, ostensibly to inspect a set piece on the stage, but the detective had positioned the lighting to create shadows that framed the man perfectly, while stagehands stood ready behind the curtains. Every escape route, every exit had been accounted for. "You have orchestrated much," the detective began, his eyes locking onto Voss. "Each death, each theft, each misdirection a calculated performance. And yet, mon cher, a performance is meaningless unless someone witnesses it." Voss' jaw tightened. I don't know what you mean." The detective smiled faintly, almost kindly. "But you do. The tickets, the powder, the subtle signs left deliberately in the wings, each one a mark of your design. And yet, even a conductor cannot fully control the music once it is heard." The man's composure cracked slightly, his gaze darting toward the wings as if calculating whether a sudden dash to freedom was possible. "Do you intend to deny it, monsieur?" the detective continued softly. "Or will you confess, now that the pattern is clear, now that your audience ethos small observes every gesture?" Voss' hands curled into fists. Then he laughed bitterly. "So clever. You think you understand me. But you cannot stop the theatre. It is mine, I control it. All of it." "Control?" the detective said, stepping closer, his voice still calm but commanding. "You confuse obsession with authority. You believe domination over objects, over people, over performances is victory. But victory is revealed only when the mind that orchestrates cannot hide behind chaos." The shadows shifted as Voss' agitation grew, and in a sudden, desperate move, he lunged for the curtain ropes, attempting to descend unseen to the backstage exits. Quick as lightning, the detective anticipated the motion, catching the man's wrist and twisting gently but firmly. Voss stumbled, caught between fury and disbelief, and then froze as stagehands stepped in from the wings, blocking any chance of escape. The inspector rushed forward. "He's caught." The detective's gaze did not leave Voss. "You see, monsieur, the theatre reveals all, but it requires patience and observation. You attempted to manipulate everyone, yet even your most meticulous plan left the faintest traces, the smallest missteps enough for one who watches closely." Voss sank to his knees, the fight leaving him in a rush of exhaustion and terror. I only wanted to protect it, to keep the theatre pure." "Yes," the detective said softly, almost with sympathy. "And in your obsession, you allowed lives to be lost. Langley, Moreau, you believe the end justified the means. But the theatre itself bears witness, and I have seen what the chaos could not hide." Voss' eyes, wide with shock and dawning comprehension, finally met the detective's. You saw it all." "I saw," the detective replied, "and now justice may follow. The pattern has been revealed, the motive exposed, and the final act brought to a close." The stage was silent, save for Voss' ragged breathing, the faint hum of the theatre's lights, and the sense that the drama, long hidden behind misdirection and fear, had at last reached its resolution. The theatre breathed in silence, the aftermath of Voss' capture hanging heavy in the air. The inspector straightened, brushing his hands over his coat, as if to convince himself the ordeal was over. Hale exhaled shakily, Clara pressed her hands together, and even Madame Renaud allowed herself a tentative nod of relief. The detective, however, remained immobile at the center of the stage, his small frame poised yet alert, eyes scanning every shadow, every line of the theatre with meticulous care. Something still tugged at the edges of his mind, a faint irregularity that refused to settle. He crouched to inspect the floor once more, tracing the faint traces of powder, the displacement of props, and the small scuff marks that had seemed inconsequential during the chase. Then he paused, noticing a detail that had escaped him before, a barely visible thread caught in the edge of the curtain. It was fine, almost invisible but perfectly positioned, and it had not been there when he examined the stage earlier. He stood, voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of tension. "Mon ami," he said to the inspector, "we have acted too quickly in our triumph. There is one detail we have overlooked." The inspector's face paled. "Another," but Vosh confessed to everything. "Confessed, yes," the detective replied. "But consider the orchestrator's psychology. Obsession with control often manifests in layers. One layer, however convincing, may conceal another deeper, more cunning, and entirely unanticipated." Clara's eyes widened. "You mean someone else?" "Yes," the detective said softly. "Observe the shadows. The one who staged the chaos, the subtle manipulations, the stolen Genalthi left a signature not in the objects, but in the reactions of those around them. And someone has profited from our focus on Voss, remaining unseen, untested, patient." He turned slowly toward Madame Renaud, his gaze gentle but probing. "Madame Renaud, you have watched and waited, seen each move, each reaction. The placement of the tickets, the faint powder, the deliberate diversionsier knowledge of the theatre, its secret passages, and the habits of those within it, exceeds even that of Voss. You are aware of every vulnerability, every predictable response." Renaud's lips parted, her composure faltering for the first time. I did what I could to protect the theatre. But I did not act directly, perhaps," the detective said, stepping closer. "Yet all the pieces align in ways that implicate someone with insight, someone capable of steering suspicion away from themselves while allowing another to take the blame. Voss was your instrument, knowingly or not, but the hand that arranged the entire performance is yours." Gasps rose from the group. Voss, still on his knees, looked up with confusion and fear. "What, how?" The detective held up a finger, calm as ever. "Notice the timing of each act, the journal's disappearance, the placement of the tickets, the subtle hints left for observation. Each led us to believe Voss was the mastermind. Yet the true architect hid behind his visible actions, orchestrating fear, manipulating perception, and testing our responses." Renaud's face paled, her eyes darting to the edges of the stage as if seeking escape. "I only wanted to preserve the theatre, to ensure it survived the recklessness of others." "Yes," the detective said softly. "Your motive, though understandable in your mind, drove events to extremes. You used another to perform the acts, allowed him to become the visible culprit, and believed the chaos would obscure your presence. Yet the pattern's subtle discrepancies, the hesitation, the faint traces of intervention revealed the truth." The room fell silent. Even the inspector looked stunned, uncertain how to reconcile the previous triumph with this revelation. The detective stepped forward, voice quiet but firm. "Voss is guilty of action, yes, but the mind behind the theatre's calamities, the mind that orchestrated every diversion and misdirection, was not him. It was the one who knew the stage, the players, and the secrets of the theatre intimately. And now, at last, we see the true conductor." Renaud's hands trembled as the weight of discovery settled over her. The detective's gaze remained unwavering, his patience, insight, and understanding of human psychology having unraveled the final, hidden layer. The mastermind, the one thought to be invisible, had been revealed not by a confession, but by the unerring logic of observation, the genius of deduction, and the theatre itself, which, as always, had witnessed everything. The theatre was heavy with silence, the echo of revelation settling over the group like a dense fog. Madame Renaud sat stiffly on the edge of the stage, her hands trembling, her face pale as the weight of exposure pressed down. Voss, still on his knees, looked between her and the detective, the shock of understanding making him seem smaller than before. The inspector, flustered and uncertain, fumbled for his notebook, as if writing everything down could somehow make sense of the impossibility he had just witnessed. The detective moved deliberately to the center, hands clasped behind his back, voice calm but carrying the authority of absolute certainty. "Justice, mon amis, is not always delivered in the form we expect. In this case, the law will take its course against those who acted, but the theatre, like any witness, remembers beyond the courtroom. He gestured toward Renaud. Madame Renaud's involvement was subtle, almost invisible. She allowed Voss to commit the visible acts, confident that suspicion would never touch her. And yet, as with all careful constructions, the smallest detail can unravel the most meticulous plan. He crouched to pick up a scrap of paper from the floor, holding it between his fingers. Notice this barely visible flourish in ink at the corner of the ticket. One might have dismissed it as an imperfection, but it repeated across the scattered tickets, each imperceptibly altered. A mind seeking perfection leaves the faintest imperfections, a signature only the keenest observer can detect. The inspector squinted. So all this time, it was her manipulating everything through Voss? Yes, the detective replied. She knew the theatre intimately, understood every passage, every habit, every fear. She allowed others to act in the foreground while she conducted from the shadows. The powder traces, the tickets, the stolen Janalthi were all placed not for chaos alone, but as instruments to guide perception, to test observation, to confirm that her influence remained undetected. Clara, still pale, whispered, "And the deaths, the attacks, were they necessary to her plan? Necessary in her mind?" the detective said softly. To assert control, to silence those she deemed threats, to create fear that ensured obedience and confusion. Yet even the most careful mind cannot erase the consequences of its actions entirely. He straightened and turned to the inspector. And now the law will act against those whose hands touched the crimes. Voss, though manipulated, must answer for what he did. Madame Renaud, though clever, cannot escape justice, forever the evidence, subtle though it was, has revealed her hand. But then the detective paused, his sharp eyes flicking toward the upper balcony where the shadows pooled more densely. A faint smile crossed his face. "Yet," he murmured, "even now, not every question is fully answered. The theatre holds secrets beyond even these revelations. The mastermind may be cornered, but obsession does not disappear with exposure. The mind that orchestrates knows how to retreat, how to survive in shadows." He allowed the group a moment to absorb the tension, then continued. "Observe what was missed by all others. The slight scuff on the floor near the orchestra pit, unnoticed until I retraced the sequence. The altered timing of the stage lights, barely perceptible but deliberate, the subtle hesitation in each alibi, which hinted at guidance unseen. These are the traces that expose the hidden hand." Voss looked up, fear still in his eyes. "So, she will be caught." The detective shook his head ever so slightly, voice calm but tinged with the gravity of truth. "Caught, perhaps. Or perhaps she will vanish, slipping from the immediate reach of law and leaving behind only the pattern, the chaos she created, and a lingering sense of unease. That, too, is a kind of justicer, at least, a reminder that the mind of the obsessed is never fully contained." The inspector muttered, "So even with all we know, it's not quite over." "No, mon ami," the detective said, eyes sweeping the theatre one last time. "But it is revealed. And revelation is the most formidable weapon of all." And as the group processed the final truths, the detective stepped back, calm, composed, and unshaken once again, proving that no chaos, no deception, no shadow could conceal what a mind trained to observe and reason could uncover. The theatre, ever a silent witness, seemed to hum in quiet approval, holding within its walls the echoes of crimes, truths, and the unsettling knowledge that some mysteries never truly vanish. The theatre had fallen into a quiet hush, the weight of revelations still pressing against every wall and shadowed corner. Voss had been escorted away, shaken and defeated, while Madame Renaud remained under close watch, her composure fractured, her obsession exposed. The inspector, still trying to make sense of the layers of deception, muttered under his breath, I don't know how we saw it at all." The detective, however, moved with deliberate calm toward the stage exit, his steps measured, hands clasped behind his back. His eyes, sharp and ever observant, lingered on the scattered tickets, the faint smudges of powder, and the subtle, nearly invisible imperfections in the props. Each item, each shadow, each tremor of hesitation had been a story, and he had read them all. Yet even now, as the theatre settled into uneasy stillness, he paused, his gaze catching a tiny detail that made his brow furrow. A folded slip of paper tucked behind the ornate column at stage right, overlooked until this moment. He bent to retrieve it carefully, unfolding the paper to reveal only a series of numbers and letters arranged in an almost nonsensical pattern. No signature, no name, no explanation, just a cryptic sequence, precise and deliberate, like a key to a puzzle yet unsolved. He straightened, eyes narrowing slightly, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Ah, always another question," he murmured softly, more to himself than to anyone else. The inspector leaned closer, curiosity piqued. "Another clue? From who? Renaud?" "Perhaps," the detective replied. "Or perhaps from someone else entirely. The mind behind these events is clever, and cleverness rarely stops at the first revelation. Some secrets, once uncovered, reveal only more mysteries waiting to be unraveled." Clara stepped forward, hesitant. "So, it's not truly over?" "Mon ami," he said gently, "it is over in one senseth immediate danger, the deaths, the manipulations, all addressed. Yet the theatre, like life, keeps its own counsel. It does not forget, and neither do some who would use its shadows to craft their designs. We have answered one question, but a puzzle often contains hidden pieces we have not yet glimpsed." He walked slowly toward the main entrance, the detective's silhouette framed by the dim, ambient light filtering through the theatre doors. Behind him, the evidence, the missteps, the manipulations all lay exposed, yet the lingering slip of paper reminded him that the game was never truly finished. The inspector sighed. "Do you always leave us with more questions than answers?" The detective's lips curved into a faint, enigmatic smile. "It is not I who leaves questions, mon ami. It is the nature of truth and the minds that shape it. Each revelation uncovers another shadow, and every shadow is a call to observe, to reason, to understand." He paused at the doorway, glancing back one last time at the theatre, the stage, the props, the faint trails of powder, and the scattered tickets that had so cunningly told the story of obsession and control. "And now," he said softly, "we wait, we watch. And when the next shadow moves, the next secret whispers, we shall be ready." With that, he stepped into the cool night air, leaving behind the theatre, the chaos, and the questions that still hung in every corner. Behind him, the faint rustle of curtains and the lingering scent of powder reminded all who remained that while one story had ended, another could begin at any moment. The mystery, like the theatre itself, was never truly finished, yet its echoes ready to draw the keenest mind into the next performance of suspense, cunning, and revelation. And so, as the detective disappeared into the streets, the theatre held its secrets, and the audience was left with the unsettling, thrilling knowledge that the mind capable of orchestrating such meticulous chaos might yet strike again, always one step ahead, always observing, and always waiting for the next act.